The mediation room smelled like old coffee and someone else's anxiety. I remember staring at the ring on my finger while my brother-in-law poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, slow and deliberate, like he was performing for an audience. Maybe he was. His lawyer had already set up a neat row of color-coded folders in front of him. Color-coded, for a divorce mediation. That told me everything I needed to know about how long they'd been planning this. My wife, Sandra, sat at the far end of the table in a charcoal blazer I'd never seen before. She looked composed in the way people look composed when they've rehearsed composure. Her mother sat one chair behind her, just outside the formal arrangement, close enough to pass notes, far enough to claim she wasn't involved. Her father hadn't bothered coming. He'd sent his opinion ahead of time through Sandra's lawyer. I was to receive my personal belongings, my truck, and whatever was left in our joint checking account after legal fees. Everything else, apparently, belonged to the family I'd married into, the house we'd spent 4 years renovating in Oakville, the landscaping business I'd built from a single used truck and a second-hand mower I bought off Kijiji when I was 26. The client list I'd grown contact by contact across 12 years of early mornings and late falls, even the shed out back where I kept my equipment. Sandra's lawyer had actually listed the shed separately. $4,200 in assessed value. They wanted the shed. Across the room from me sat my father. He'd driven 2 hours from Barrie that morning without me asking. He'd just shown up at 7 a.m. with 2 Tim Hortons large doubles and said he'd ride along if I didn't mind. I didn't mind. I'd been dreading walking into that building alone more than I'd been dreading the meeting itself. He'd been quiet through the first 40 minutes of opening statements, just sitting there with his hands folded on the table, listening, with the patience of someone who has heard enough noise in his life to know which sounds actually matter. Then Sandra's lawyer began listing assets again. The house, the business accounts, the equipment, the client contracts. He used the word equitable 4 times in one paragraph. That was when my father leaned toward me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Give it to her," he said. "All of it." I looked at him. I was certain I'd misunderstood. He didn't repeat himself. He just held my eyes for a second, then settled back in his chair like he'd said something completely ordinary. Across the table, Sandra's brother was already smiling. "My name is Gareth Malone. I grew up in Innisfil, the kind of small town where everybody knows which families have money and which ones are just making do. We were the latter. My father ran a small plumbing operation for 30 years, drove the same van until it started embarrassing my mother at church, and never once complained about either. He believed in doing the work, keeping your word, and not talking too much about either. I absorbed those lessons without knowing I was absorbing them. I started mowing lawns at 14 for the neighbors down the road. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I liked the order of it. The before and after, the visible difference you could see when you were done. By 17, I had 6 regular clients and a second-hand push mower with a bent wheel I'd fixed with electrical tape and stubbornness. My father watched all of this without much comment. Once, when I asked if he thought I was wasting my time, he said, "If it pays and you don't hate it, it's not a waste." That was the longest piece of career advice he ever gave me. By the time I was 28, I had a crew of 4, a fleet of 2 trucks, and contracts with 3 property management companies in the Halton region. The business wasn't glamorous. Landscaping rarely is. But it was mine in a way that felt different from owning a possession. It felt more like I'd grown it from something small and watched it become something real. That's when I met Sandra. She worked in marketing for a commercial real estate company in Mississauga. She was sharp and well put together and laughed at things I said in a way that felt genuine. Her family was from the Annex in Toronto, comfortably wealthy in the quiet, old money way that doesn't flash but always lands softly. Her father was a semi-retired corporate lawyer. Her mother curated art and sat on boards. Her brother worked in finance and had opinions about everything, including me. I remember the first family dinner. Her mother asked what I did, and when I said landscaping, there was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long before she smiled and said, "How wonderful." Her brother asked later whether I'd ever considered going back to school. I said I'd never left school, really. Every season taught me something. He nodded like I'd said something quaint. Sandra defended me that night. She took my hand on the drive home and said her family was just adjusting. She said what mattered was what we thought. I believed her. I believed her for years, actually. Longer than I should have. We got married in September, 4 years after we met. Small ceremony on a property in Caledon. A client had offered the venue as a gift after I'd redone their gardens. I thought it was perfect. I overheard Sandra's mother mention to someone that it was charming for a backyard wedding. I let it go. That became a pattern. I let things go because the alternative seemed petty, and because Sandra always found a way to smooth things over after. a touch on the arm, a private eye roll that said she was on my side. It was enough for a long time. But something shifted around year 7. I can't point to a single moment. It was more like I started noticing the shape of things. The way Sandra would sigh when I got home with mud on my boots, even though I always took them off at the door. The way she described the business to her friends. Never quite lying, but never quite proud either. Gareth does property services, she'd say, in the same tone you'd use for something serviceable but not exciting. Her family stopped adjusting and started just being themselves. Her father referred to me as the landscaper once at a dinner, not to be cruel, just as a category. Her brother made a comment at Christmas about how I must have great forearms from all the manual work. Sandra laughed, I smiled. Later I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. The thing that nobody tells you about being underestimated for long enough is that it stops feeling like an insult. It starts feeling like the air in the room. You stop noticing it because it's just always there. And then one day you realize you've started believing it yourself, just a little. You start measuring your worth through eyes that were never going to measure you fairly. That might be the most expensive thing I gave away in that marriage, and I gave it away for free, years before any lawyer got involved. I found out about the affair on a Friday in early March, not through a private investigator or a dramatic confrontation. I found out because Sandra had used our shared laptop to log into her email, forgot to sign out, and I needed to print a quote for a client. I wasn't snooping. I was printing. The email was open. I read it in about 40 seconds. That was enough. The man's name was familiar. He ran a mid-sized property development company that had been circling our region for a couple of years. Sandra and I had actually discussed them once, whether they might be a potential client. I remembered thinking it was a lead worth following up on. I hadn't realized she'd already followed up. I closed the laptop. I drove to a Tim Hortons on the highway and sat in the parking lot for an hour and a half. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there watching transport trucks pull in and out and thought about what I actually wanted to do next. I decided I wasn't going to react. Not yet. This might sound cold. It didn't feel cold. It felt like the first time in years I'd made a decision from something solid. Every argument I'd avoided, every insult I'd absorbed with a smile, every time I'd let my own voice get a little quieter to keep the peace, none of that had protected anything. Being agreeable had not made me valued. It had made me convenient. I was done being convenient. Over the following weeks, I did things quietly. I called an accountant I trusted, a woman I'd been referred to through my business association, who specialized in separating business assets during divorce proceedings. I called a family lawyer in Oakville, not the first name I found, but someone who had been recommended specifically for cases involving small business ownership. I didn't tell Sandra I was talking to either of them. I went to those appointments the same way I went to estimate jobs, practically, without drama. The accountant went through 3 years of our financials. What she found wasn't criminal, but it was clarifying. Several expenses had been routed through our joint accounts in ways that muddied the line between personal and business. Some of those decisions had been made on my advice. Some had been made while I was away at job sites and hadn't been discussed at all. The paper trail told a story, and the story wasn't the one Sandra's lawyer would eventually try to tell. I also talked to my longtime clients, carefully, professionally, and formalized contracts that had previously been handshake arrangements, the kind of arrangements that work fine when everyone's acting in good faith, and fall apart immediately when they're not. By the time Sandra filed in June, the business my lawyer had on record looked different from the business her lawyer thought they were claiming. Not fraudulently different, just accurately different. The morning of the mediation, I wore the same thing I wear to client walkthroughs. Dark work pants, a clean collared shirt, my boots. Sandra's brother came in wearing a suit. I think he'd hoped I'd show up in something he could feel superior about. I hadn't made his morning easier, but I hadn't dressed to impress anyone either. I just dressed like myself. When my father said, "Give it to her," I understood something shift in me. Not immediately. For about 3 seconds I sat there thinking he'd lost his mind. Give her the business I'd built across 12 years. Give her the house I'd personally re-drywalled, re-insulated, re-sided over 4 winters. Give her the client relationships I'd maintained, through my own word and my own work. Then I watched my father's face. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't sympathetic in a worried way. He looked the way he looked when he'd figured something out and was letting me catch up. I thought about what the accountant had told me. I thought about what my lawyer had outlined in our last meeting. I thought about what Sandra had said on the phone to her mother the previous November, which I hadn't been meant to hear, but had, through the vent in the hallway while I was changing out of my work clothes. She'd said she was tired of explaining me to people. She'd said she thought she'd given up too much coming down to my level. I thought about the shed. $4,200. They had actually listed the shed. I turned to my lawyer and nodded. The next 20 minutes were the strangest I've ever sat through. I agreed to terms so quickly that Sandra's lawyer literally stopped mid-sentence to ask my lawyer to confirm. Sandra herself looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from her before. It wasn't triumph, it was something more unsettled than that, like someone who had prepared extensively for a fight that wasn't coming, and didn't know what to do with their hands. Her brother pulled out his phone under the table. I assume he was texting their father. I imagine that conversation went well for about 10 minutes. What happened next didn't happen in a courtroom. There was no dramatic reveal, no moment where a judge looked over their glasses and declared justice served. The consequences unfolded the way real consequences usually do, slowly, and through ordinary channels, and without the satisfaction of an audience. The house sold within 4 months. The proceeds covered the mortgage, legal fees, and not much else once carrying costs were factored in. The Oakville market had softened by then, and the renovation work I'd done, while thorough, had been assessed at lower than Sandra expected. Her lawyer had valued the property based on peak comparables from 18 months prior. The actual sale told a different story. The equipment Sandra's lawyers had itemized so carefully turned out to be worth considerably less without the contracts that came with it. Equipment without clients is just steel sitting in a yard. The property management companies I worked with were contracted to Malone Land Services specifically, to me, to my license, to the insurance I carried in my name. Those contracts didn't transfer. New ownership would have had to rebid them from scratch. Nobody told Sandra's team that until after the mediation concluded. There was also the matter of the development company. I won't go into detail because it's still not entirely resolved. But when a person shares information about a competitor's service contracts, during a period when they're also negotiating on behalf of that competitor's client base, there are professional and potentially regulatory implications. My accountant flagged it. My lawyer flagged it. At some point, someone at the relevant industry body was also made aware. I didn't push that process. I just didn't stop it. The man Sandra had been seeing distanced himself from her within weeks of proceedings becoming more complicated. I'd expected that. People who operate the way he operated don't absorb consequences alongside the people they've involved in their problems. They recalibrate and move on. Sandra had believed she was important to him. I suspect she learned otherwise in a way that was harder to absorb than losing the house. I heard through a mutual acquaintance about 8 months later that Sandra had moved into a rental in Burlington. I wished her nothing good and nothing bad. I mostly didn't think about it. My father didn't explain his advice until about 2 weeks after the mediation. We were at his kitchen table in Barrie, eating the soup my mother had left in the fridge before going to her book club. He'd reheated it without fanfare and set a bowl in front of me without asking if I was hungry, the way he always did. I asked him what he'd seen that I hadn't in that room. He was quiet for a moment. He tore a piece of bread and said he hadn't seen anything I hadn't seen. He just knew what they wanted wasn't what they thought they wanted. He said, "They wanted to beat you. You can't beat someone who stops fighting back." I asked him how he'd known I had enough positioned already to walk away. He said he hadn't known that at all. He said he just knew me. That sat with me for a long time. Still does, honestly. He hadn't trusted a strategy. He'd trusted the person the strategy came from, because he'd watched me build things carefully for 20 years and knew I didn't build things to lose them to carelessness. He wasn't giving me tactical advice. He was giving me permission to use what I'd already prepared. I don't say this to make myself sound clever. I spent 2 years of that marriage accepting treatment I should have walked away from after 2 months. I spent years measuring my worth through the approval of people who had privately decided I wasn't worth their respect. I let an entire relationship teach me that being steady and competent and reliable made me predictable, and let myself believe that predictable was close enough to valued. It wasn't. It never was. Predictable just meant they weren't afraid I'd leave. The business is in better shape now than it was during the marriage. Part of that is practical. I'm not managing 2 sets of financial interests anymore, and I'm not spending energy on relationships that were costing me more than they returned. Part of it is harder to explain. When you stop trying to prove something to people who are never going to acknowledge it anyway, you have a lot more space for the actual work. I hired a 4th crew last spring. We took on our first commercial contract with a regional municipality, a parks maintenance agreement for a community in Milton. I drove out to look at the site on a Tuesday afternoon in April, early season, ground just thawed and everything still grey and flat. I stood there thinking about what it would look like by July, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. Something that didn't require anyone else to be in the room. My kids. I have two, a son who's 8 and a daughter who's 6. Come to me every other week under the arrangement we finalized after mediation. It wasn't the custody I would have chosen. No one in that situation gets what they would have chosen. But I have them Thursday to Sunday, and I've made those days into something that belongs to us. We cook. We do projects in the garage. Last November, we raked every leaf off my property into a pile in the backyard, which took the better part of a Saturday afternoon. And then they jumped in it until my daughter's boot came off, and we couldn't find it for 15 minutes. That afternoon cost me nothing. It's one of the things I think about most often when I think about what I'm building now. I'm aware that some people hear a story like this and want to know about the moment of triumph. The scene where the other side realizes they lost and the protagonist walks out into the sunlight feeling vindicated. I understand that. I wanted that too for a while. I thought it would feel like something. What actually happened is more ordinary and, in the end, more useful. There was no moment. There were just months of small consequences accumulating for people who had made confident decisions based on incomplete information. There were no apologies, no dramatic reversals, no scenes. Sandra's brother stopped texting me somewhere around September. Sandra's mother sent a card when the divorce was finalized that said she hoped things would be easier for both of us going forward. I put it in the recycling without responding and felt completely fine about it. The man who had spent years making jokes about my forearms at family dinners, I saw him once at a gas station in Mississauga about 14 months after the mediation. We made eye contact. He looked away first. We both knew what that meant. It was the most I was ever going to get, and I found, standing there in the cold filling my truck, that it was actually enough. There is something people don't tell you about rebuilding after a loss that turned out not to be what you thought it was. It's quieter than you expect. Nobody throws you a party for recovering your own self-respect. There's no moment where someone important acknowledges that you were right, or that you were treated unfairly. It just gradually becomes true that you spend your days doing work that means something to you, surrounded by people who actually want to be around you. And you stop thinking about whether someone in a charcoal blazer in a mediation room in Oakville would have approved of how you turned out. I walked into that room expecting the worst day of my life. What I lost was a version of myself I'd been slowly pruning away to fit into a life that had never quite fit back. What I found, sitting across the table from people who thought they were watching me surrender, was that I hadn't lost anything that belonged to me. The things that were mine, the real things, were still exactly where I'd left them. They always had been.